Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're digging into After the Cataclysm by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. Now, this book asks a really fascinating question. After all the fighting stops and the dust settles, how do powerful media systems go about, well, reconstructing our memory of what just happened? How does the official story of a war get written after the fact? To really get a grip on this, the book offers up this fantastic metaphor. Let's imagine for a second that the story of a war is being told to us through a camera. But this isn't just any camera. It has a very specific, let's call it a flaw.
Right, so this camera has a very peculiar limitation. It's got this incredibly powerful zoom lens, It can focus in on the tiniest, most granular details, but, and this is the important part, its ability to pan out and show you the bigger picture, it's just completely broken. So after a war is over, this camera zooms right in with crystal clear focus on the immediate, horrifying aftermath. We see it all: the refugee camps, the food shortages, the terrible atrocities committed by the new governments that have taken power. The suffering is absolutely real, and this camera makes sure we don't miss a single heart-wrenching detail.
But here's the crucial twist. That camera, it never, ever pans back. It just refuses to show the years, sometimes even decades, of bombing, of invasion, and political meddling that created that wasteland in the first place. The entire history that led up to the suffering is just left completely outside the frame.
And that's the core of the problem, right? The book argues that by controlling the frame, the system completely controls the story of cause and effect. If the only thing you're allowed to see is the end of the story, that post-war chaos, then of course the new regime becomes the one and only villain. The original aggressor? They've just sort of vanished from the picture entirely. So, you have to ask, how is this camera frame built? And how is it held so rigidly in place? What is the machinery, the nuts and bolts, that operates this powerful ideological zoom lens? Well, Chomsky and Herman point to three main mechanisms that keep this frame locked in. First, you've got information filtering, which is all about deciding which atrocities get our attention and which ones don't. Then there are intellectual incentives, these subtle pressures on experts and commentators to adopt certain assumptions. And finally, there's selective discourse, which is about how the language of human rights gets applied, but only to certain situations. Okay, let's dive into that first mechanism, information filtering. To really show how this works, the book uses this absolutely stunning real-world comparison, contrasting what it calls benign versus nefarious terror.
Okay, so check this out. We have two horrific events that happen right around the same time. On one side, you have the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. It was backed by the US, and the crimes were well documented and easy to prove, but they were almost completely ignored by the mainstream press. This is what the authors call benign terror. Atrocities committed by our allies, so they're treated as, well, not that important. Then, on the other side, you have the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Here, reliable facts were actually really hard to come by, but the atrocities were endlessly magnified, repeated, and amplified. That's nefarious terror, crimes committed by official enemies which serve a very useful propaganda purpose.
So the really crucial point here is that this kind of filtering isn't random. Not at all. It's systematic. And it's all held in place by this interconnected system where the different pillars of the establishment all work together to reinforce the exact same frame. The book explains this with a pretty powerful idea. It's not about old-school censorship with a big club. Instead, it works by setting these unspoken rules of the game, these assumptions that you don't even question. So the press can be super critical, sure, but only within these really narrow patriotic boundaries. You can argue all day about how a war was fought, but you can't really question why it was fought or whether it should have been fought in the first place. Anyone who steps outside those limits, they just find themselves outside the conversation. And this is how the whole system just locks itself into place. You can see how all the pieces fit together. Foreign policy kicks things off and sets the agenda. Economic policies like sanctions create the hardship on the ground. Then media framing comes in and assigns the blame for that hardship. And finally, academics and other experts provide the whole thing with a stamp of legitimacy. Each part reinforces the other, creating this really tight, closed loop of logic. So what is the ultimate result of this whole meticulously constructed frame? Well, it creates what we might call a crisis in perception. The end result is this state of public understanding where we can all clearly see the awful outcomes, the famine, the refugees, the violence, but the historical reasons why these things are happening have been systematically erased. We see the effect, but we are actively prevented from seeing the cause. And this leads to a final incredible maneuver that the book calls agent transference. The nation that was the primary cause of all the devastation, the causal agent, is magically transformed in the public's mind. It becomes just a concerned bystander, or maybe even a humanitarian leader, wringing its hands over the very chaos it helped create, and then offering to help clean up a mess it refuses to admit it made. Now, this model of analysis was written about Indochina decades ago, but that central question the book poses feels more relevant than ever. Now that you know how the camera works, how it zooms in but refuses to pan back, where else do you see that exact same limited frame being used in the world today?
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.